So good morning, good afternoon to everyone. Welcome to this seventh edition of the webinar that we are organizing in our conversation series at UNU Macau. So since last year. So my name is Serge Tingvish. I'm the head of research at the United Nations University Institute in Macau. So in this series of webinar, we are discussing mainly the interrelationship between decision makings, artificial intelligence models, as well as their positive and negative impacts on achieving the Sustainable Development Goals and their consequences in terms of policies. So we are giving the voice to the top researchers around the world in order to hear their thoughts on those very important subjects nowadays. So today, we have the great pleasure and also the honor to receive Professor Rostam Neuwirth for a presentation with quite a mysterious title, Artificial Intelligence and Sustainable Development, Two Oxymora, One Challenge. So I guess you will explain later why AI and SDGs are both can be considered as oxymora. So it's, yeah. And I have a copy of your book with me, so maybe it's difficult with the, like that. So you just published a new book, and maybe we will talk later about this book. Just to present you briefly, Professor Neuwirth, so you are professor in law and also head of the Department of Global Legal Studies at the Faculty of Law at the University of Macau. So you have taught previously at the West Bengal University of Geological Sciences in Kolkata and the Hidayatullah National Law University in Raipur, India. So you received a PhD from the European University Institute from Florence in Italy, and you just released this book, so entitled the EU Artificial Intelligence Act, Regulating Subliminal AI Systems, so published by Routledge. And I guess you will talk more about this new book in your presentation. Previously, you wrote another book, so it's your second book, Law in the Time of Oxymora, a synesthesia of language, logic and law, so also published by Routledge. And you are also the authors of numerous other publications that focus on contemporary global legal problems, where you explore the interrelationship and linkage between law on one end, language, art, culture, society, technology on the other end. So Professor Rostam Neuwirth, the floor is yours now. So you have something like 30, 40 minutes for your presentation. And after that, we will have a Q&A session with the audience. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Serge, for this kind introduction and also, most of all, for the kind invitation. I'm really happy to meet you again because, in fact, the United Nations University in Macau was also very crucial in the making of my most recent book. So you have inspired all of you through several events we held together, and already this invitation also triggered many new thoughts, and I hope we can have a fruitful discussion. Maybe something will also come out in terms of written contributions in the future. So first I would like to share my screen. I hope you can all see it. I have prepared some slides on my topic today, which is artificial intelligence and sustainable development, two oxymora, one challenge, as a question. And in fact, as you already said, I have a long-standing interest in oxymora, these rhetorical devices that are considered like contradictions in terms, usually combined into one or two words put in context, like artificial intelligence and sustainable development are such kind of rhetorical figures of speech, as I will show. So what the first question is, what do they have in common? And I have already anticipated the answer in a way. They have, in fact, a lot of things in common, I believe, even though I only found one article which really addresses the issue jointly. But my focus is first the linguistic context and the linguistic nexus between them, namely that they have been qualified as oxymora. There's more, I think, like you mentioned, the decision-making is extremely important individually, collectively, for organizations, for companies, for everyone. And decision-making, as far as I've studied it as a lawyer, involves very many complex processes, starting with the perception of the senses and then a kind of cognitive reasoning, processing of the data, like in a computer, I suppose, and then decision-making based on these processes. And in this complex process, I think language and technology play an important role, in particular because with AI, I think we are now also on the verge of trying to artificially replicate, as it says, human intelligence, human decision making. And sustainable development, I think the sustainable development goals are also like faced with a serious challenge in terms of decision making, of course, because we have 17 goals. How do we decide to achieve each one of them, all of them together? And that is also like a very complex process. So in that sense, I think there have already a lot of commonalities. But here, this is the article I found, published 2020, Artificial Intelligence and Sustainable Development. And the author immediately says that artificial intelligence is basically changing all aspects of our life and created profound disrupting and enabling impact. So it has a dual, and that's also important, kind of potential. It can be good, can be bad, can be beneficial, can be harmful. I think in the past, there's another article that says we are now moving from a race to the development of AI to a race to the regulation of AI. And I think this shift in the race indicates that first there was a kind of enthusiasm, what we can do with it and how it will solve all our problems. But unfortunately, as most of the time in human history, every new technology, every new development has both potentially harmful and also, of course, beneficial effects. And we should, I think, for the future, generally try to be balanced in kind of focusing on both at the same time, like an oxymoron, like good and bad in one word would be an oxymoron. And here we can also say we should adopt this kind of thinking. And as the author also explains, AI is therefore a double-edged sword. It can come with multifaceted pitfalls and complex problems that must be studied and managed to contain both its negative and unintended consequences, but also, of course, to allow for the potential to unfold. So it has also, that's very important, sorry, mentioned here, of course, a role to play in global sustainability, because I think they also, in this respect, they share something, that they're cross-cutting phenomena. They cut through everything, and they affect every aspect of life, and therefore are very complex problems that require very, like, probably even novel forms of cognition, reasoning, and decision-making. And about the mentioned shift from a race to the development to the regulation, UNESCO had in November adopted this recommendation on the ethics of artificial intelligence, which is really, I think, a very important step, because it shows a very strong and large consensus among the global community that recognizing here like the dynamic positive impacts of artificial intelligence, but also the potential negative ones. So here we have a balanced approach. And what inspired me a lot in this kind of recommendation, I will talk about that later a bit, because it led to my book, is it not only has an impact on societies, the environment, ecosystems, on human lives, but also the human mind in particular, because AI can also influence human thinking, interaction, and decision-making. And I will also mention that it can not only influence it, it can really, really subliminally, like below the threshold of our awareness, change our thoughts, manipulate them, and therefore also alter our behavior. And this is really a serious concern that we should all be aware of, I believe, and that should be also globally addressed, because, as I said, like sustainability, it is a global concern, it is a global phenomenon, and we are all in the same boat here. And this recommendation also makes a reference to the Sustainable Development Goals, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. So this is important. And here is another one, for example, it refers to the Human Rights Council resolution on the right to privacy in the digital age. And this is exactly something I will also talk about, that we are faced with new challenges from the perspective of fundamental rights, like the right to privacy and the right to freedom of thought in particular, because some of these technologies of AI can really, like, as I said, manipulate our thoughts without us being even aware of it. But also the recommendation of the ethics of AI of the UNESCO also has a specific principle, sustainability, where it mentions again this kind of importance to develop these technologies that they can benefit, but also hinder the realization of the SDGs. So we have, again, the same dilemma. Well, it's not that they guarantee we have solved all our future problems. No, with these new potential, like possibilities, come also a lot of responsibilities. And here also the SDGs themselves already mentioned in 2015 the spread of information and communications technology, global interconnectedness has great potential to accelerate human progress, but we also must consider the potential problems that may arise from it. So one thing with, as I said in the beginning, is sustainable development goals a kind of challenge to cognition and decision making, because we have 17. And here I would like to recall one of our meetings where actually there was, the heading was SDG summit, so only sustainable development goal. And that in me triggered at the time the actual thought that it's not about sustainable development goals. It's actually only one. There should be only one sustainable development goal, which is to realize all 17. And that's the only goal, and not probably balance one or the other and neutralize them. And I think this is related to the rhetorical figures of Oxymora. So how do we achieve the SDGs, or actually the only SDG, without ending up in strange loops, like a phenomenon that has been qualified as one where you start with something and you unexpectedly find yourself right back to the beginning. So back to the beginning, like in Escher's paintings, very well depicted always these kind of seemingly impossible visualizations of this phenomenon, but actually most of the time, even though we may consider that it's impossible to build them, but I think when it comes to decision making, we very often find ourselves back to square one. And this is something that is also expressed, for example, through Oxymora. And here is one that I came across when I did some research on discrimination and human rights, basically, that, for example, someone qualified prioritizing equality an oxymoron. So do we now say, do we have to prioritize one sustainable development goal out of the 17? Then we are actually creating, again, a strange loop where we maybe neutralize the progress made in another one. So we should actually not prioritize equality because it's an oxymoron, or we should prioritize equality in the sense that we achieve all of them equally. And this is also related to problems of multiple discrimination or multiple fundamental rights violations, for example. And this is then related to the concept of the indivisibility of human rights, which is based on the idea that no human right can be fully realized without all others being actually realized. So I think it should be the same about SDGs. We should say no single sustainable development goal can be fully realized without all others being realized. And so we have, again, a kind of dilemma. And this is interesting with regard to these dilemmatic situations that, and that is not me. And when I wrote my book on law in the time of Oxymora, it was always misunderstood in a sense that some people thought yeah, he's creating an oxymoron out of everything, which is true in a way, because I have a good collection of them, but it wasn't me who created them. So here you see that someone has qualified artificial intelligence as an oxymoron, very clearly. The term artificial intelligence is an oxymoron because intelligence by nature cannot be artificial, and therefore it's a contradiction in terms. From a book here, The Future, a very short introduction. When it comes to sustainable development, there are many more on AI too. I just picked this one. When it comes to sustainable development, there are many more writings. Here you see quite a collection of those where authors, independently of each other from very different angles, all use this term. And I think this is what initially rang a bell in my interest in my research, because this cannot be coincidence, in my view, that independently a lot of experts in so many fields, not just in law and policymaking, in the arts, in philosophy, in physics, in the hard sciences, in the soft sciences, etc., use this term, and it seems to be a trend. So here you see that someone said also sustainable development is an oxymoron because it's against the laws of nature. that we don't have unlimited resources. We cannot always go for growth. We need to find a way to sustain and yet change. And this was also used by an Italian writer, the Lampedusa paradox. For things to remain the same, things have to change. And that's the connection between paradoxes and oxymora, as I explain in my book. That a paradox can be more than 2-3 words, but essentially an oxymoron is a paradox condensed into 1 or 2 words. And this is also what Charles Handy, for example, in 1995 already said: we are living in the age of paradox. James Rosenau, the quote in the middle here, he said the 21st century will be basically a time where we have to discern powerful tensions, profound contradictions, and perplexing paradoxes. And then in 2018, I did a lot of research for the legal field and collected a lot of these examples, because I think we live now also in a time of oxymora, and especially law is suffering. Here you can see other such paradoxes that reflect this, I think, characterization of our time as a paradox. Namely, David held one. He says the paradox of our times is very simple. We have a lot of collective issues that we must grapple with, which are global in nature, like the pandemic, like sustainable development. But very often the approach is very national, local, and weak and incomplete. I think incomplete is extremely important because it points out the kind of incoherence in the approach. So prioritizing one over the other, or not regarding, or maybe neglecting one and prioritizing the other. It is also an interesting paradox connected to the term the Anthropocene, because on the one hand we say now humans are the dominant factor, we are in control of the planet, we live all the imprints, but on the other hand we cannot solve any of the global problems that we have maybe also contributed to, because we are the dominant factor. So here you see this kind of paradoxical problem emerge again. And I think this means we have come to a point where we need to change the way we think. And this is also important for law, especially with regard to language, as it was mentioned here in this book in the foreword. Law changes as language changes, perhaps because language changes. And I think we are in a time where the language is subject to drastic changes. And one of these changes is that we have more and more contradictions, and they are expressed through paradoxes and oxymora. And then this was also remarked by a professor of law like Andrew Lang. He said the kind of change in law and in institution reform only basically happens in line with cognitive change. So you also need to have a cognitive change, and that is represented in technological change and in linguistic change before other changes can materialize. So this is the challenge, I think, that we are facing, and the connections between artificial intelligence and in particular sustainable development and global governance, if you want, and both are global governance problems. Also AI is a global challenge, and I think. And here I want to come back to the kind of legal reasoning. In my book, I start with this kind of danger that if you don't control your mind, the mind will control you, is a popular saying. But if you can't control your own mind, possibly also someone else will be able to control it for you. And mind control is a neutral term. Like I said, like AI is a neutral technology. It depends on what we use the control for. But we must be not naive and not too enthusiastic that it's only for good. And in this respect, I mentioned already the UNESCO adopting this draft text, the recommendation on the ethics, where it says the impact on the human mind is very important. And today I will also talk a bit about the European Union's proposal for an AIA, an Artificial Intelligence Act, which is still in the making, but which has one article, that is Article 5, Paragraph 1, which prohibits actually a specific kind of AI systems, which are those that deploy subliminal techniques, which means it's below the threshold of a person's awareness, or here, as they say, beyond the person's consciousness. So you're not aware of it. And then they are able to materially distort and change a person's behavior. But it must be in a manner that causes or is likely to cause a kind of harm. The whole scope of the article, since it hasn't been adopted yet, is not yet clear. And there are suggestions to widen it or to narrow it down or something. This is also discussed in a book. But the importance is, and I believe that strongly, the challenge will remain that we have now techniques which can really, really go deep into our mind, even into areas that we are not fully aware of. And according to some scientific findings that I found recently, we are only functioning with 5% of our entire cognitive functions above the level of awareness. So most other functions we are not fully aware of. I mean, when we walk, when we chew food, or when we drive a car even, most of it is running automatically in the background. I think computer scientists can use some nice analogies here, how a background and the operating system may work, and we are not fully aware of it. We don't see it on the screen. But now if we think for a second that it is possible to tap not only into the 5% of the functions that determine our decisions and so on, but also into the other 95%, then it is very easy to understand how powerful these techniques, AI systems can be, these subliminal systems, if they can really kind of have an influence there. And here I would like to remind also that there's this right of the freedom of thought, like in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And in an article that I found very interesting by Bublitz, he argues that this is a bit of a forgotten right. And I also feel it was always a bit in the shadow of religion. But now I think it will gain a very important role in the future because, and like he says, it is now for the law to define freedom of thought because we have so many neuroscientific insights and even possibilities to intervene into them and basically directly hack into the mind or the brain. And therefore it is needed. And when we look at the history of this subliminal phenomenon, it is subliminal advertising that was for a very long time in the 50s, 60s making the headlines. There was this experiment about Coca-Cola and popcorn being screened in the cinema. Very briefly, people didn't notice it, but they saw it subconsciously. And then apparently these sales went up. And I will not stay too long. This is very interesting history. It was even in Vienna, actually, that Otto Pötzl did the first kind of experiments with dreams. And he was able to prove in a way that even the subliminal perception of information through the visual sense will leave some traces in the mind and can then therefore also influence the person. But it was in America then that James McCarry, for example, tried to use this method. How can we use that to make money, basically, and how can we make money through advertising out of this? And this was for a very long time quite controversial. But I would like to mention already this book in 1957, which was quite pioneering, I think, because it not only saw the potential for these subliminal strategies to manipulate consumer behavior, but also potentially political, to have an impact on politics, namely to manipulate maybe the outcome of elections or the way to promote politicians to win elections and so on. And this has, with the Cambridge Analytica scandal, I think become in many ways true. So I think that was already discussed a long time ago, long before AI as such was used. And here are some examples how advertisers use this kind of technique. For example, when tobacco advertising was banned, then they used this barcode, and when the car drove by very quickly, then it would look like and subliminally recall the brand that was behind that. So this is just an interesting example. Also, many logos, they use this kind of subliminal effects, that there are different colors, different moods, different services, and so on and so forth. And this is being used and has been used for a long time. And therefore also subliminal advertising has been banned in many, many countries around the world. The EU had completely, even the Council of Europe, completely banned it in 1989 already. Macau also has a similar ban. And most other advertising laws also say that misleading advertising is prohibited. So this is of course misleading if you are in a way not aware of it. So I think here we have a precedent that is also important for banning kind of subliminal AI. And there were other debates in the US. For example, there was a use, which is kind of positive in a way, that you played background music, you embedded some messages, do not steal, and then people would not shoplift in a department store. But another negative case was in the 1990s, there were several lawsuits against some rock bands where there was claimed that embedded subliminal messages in the songs led to some suicides by teenagers and caused therefore were potentially perhaps causal to that, even though the courts could not establish that. But overall, to cut a very long story short, I think this summarizes it quite well, that nowadays in nudging artificial intelligence, we have moved now from programming computers to programming people. Or to call, I found another quote in neuromarketing. They said, it's no longer a question whether this is efficient, it's only how it manipulates consumer behavior. So this is pretty much, after long scientific controversies, I think it is pretty clearly established. But here we come to something else, and here I would like to use an analogy between even the 17 Sustainable Development Goals and maybe perception, namely the senses, the role of the senses, because we are not only functioning through visual senses or what we hear. So subliminal kind of sensations can also be carried by smell. Just go to a Macau casino and you will smell the fragrance in the air condition, and that may trigger some associations with a dinner you had there or a jackpot you won or something. And then touch and all the senses are involved in this. And this has also implications from a legal perspective, which I discuss in the book, namely, is where do we draw the line for this threshold? And this is a study these are studies that have been conducted under the term psychophysics. But in the end, I think the status quo or the scientific consensus is that there is no such threshold, because first of all, human beings are different. So everybody sees or hears more or less, but not only between persons, even individually, intrapersonally, I might be, in the morning, maybe I'm fresh, I hear better, I see better, I'm more aware. And in the evening, I get tired, and you can already subliminally easily influence me. So we have no such thresholds, which is why I think the law should not use subliminal. I said it should use transliminal, because it involves both manipulation at the level of awareness and below the level. So transliminal would go through both. That is my suggestion. I don't know. I don't think the lawmaker will take it, but subliminal has an important also meaning because of the historical precedent of advertising. But the questions that are raised are now, what is the role of the senses? And I think what I've learned studying the senses is that the senses have been usually limited to 5. And then they have also been studied separately, hardly ever in connection, all of them. And I think this is a similar problem we see in law and policymaking and in the Sustainable Development Goals. We are not taught to use the senses in a combined way. And there's a very interesting condition called synesthesia, which I discuss also in my book. I don't have time, I think, to discuss it here, but where people have the ability to listen to music, they see colors, they have maybe other sensations, goosebumps. In fact, we all have it. The more I studied it, the more I realized we all have this inborn, but we are not trained in that way. We always trained in one sense over the other instead of combining them. So the reality is multisensory, but we have fragmented in many ways. And we have a lot of phenomena where we see that also, like that we are so accustomed with arguing, contesting, rather than accepting that there is maybe a broader picture, like this viral dress. Some see it gold and white, most others see it black and blue, I think. And even like some sensory kind of conflicts, like the durian fruit or stinky tofu, they taste well but smell badly maybe. So which is also something that we express through Oxymora, that you may be right and wrong at the same time. And imagine this dress. I always think of it when I worked in court. If you ask a witness and then some say white and gold and some say black and blue, and both are saying the truth because that's what they saw, but what they saw is not necessarily the same. So in this sense, we need to also, I think, for the future, deal with the senses very differently, even in law, as I will mention later. But generally, the world is multisensory and we function multisensory. And therefore, this is in particular important because a lot of new technologies, especially augmented and virtual realities, tend to converge the senses into like a combination of that. We create a full virtual reality, by the way, another oxymoron, according to many. And this, if the machines are doing it, we are replicating actually how we are. And maybe we learn through this process, we learn how we really function, namely based on the interplay between the senses. Sometimes they conflict, sometimes they reinforce the information. And we could say probably that the more the senses converge in a way in the information they send to the mind, to the switchboard, the more it is reliable in a sense, probably. And not whether you see something, it smells badly, but it tastes well. It could be rotten, but it could also be something delicious. So we have to have a process of reasoning, of cognition that supports what we perceive. So basically, there are many very efficient subliminal advertising techniques already in place, like also known as dark patterns. And it's a combination, as I said, of both supraliminal and subliminal methods like click and bait and all these things like pop-up videos, and they lead you down a road where you cannot get in the end. As a consumer, you are really tricked. But this is becoming much more sophisticated. And like here, I think the combination of all the possibilities that we have today, and not just one alone, not like big data alone, not just maybe social media presence, I mean, not alone a wearable health device. It's the combination of all of them that makes it so efficient. And it is really amazing. After I had finished the book, I have completely, I've seen my own presence in social media through very different eyes, because I all of a sudden detected some information that popped up regularly, and then I found out why, and so on and so forth. So I think it's really useful to be aware of that, to also protect yourself from these algorithms and all these technologies that are already being used, but many more are being created. Like we are replicating the entire human body and also the senses. In the future, I think we will not only be able to have television to see far, to have radio to hear far, we can also taste, smell far, and feel far, probably. So then the whole senses, all the senses will be artificially replicated. And then with, there are some studies, for example, this here in this book by Mlodinov, Subliminal, very interesting, where a computer and then using, I think, functional magnetic resonance imaging combined with some data about the user allows the computer to select from the internet images that the machine thinks resemble those that the person is thinking about. And here you see basically how similar they are. And that is already basically a mind reading device, even though not precise yet. But that book is from 2012. So I don't know, 10 years later, maybe the image is already much better and much more precise. So we know for 100 years already that this semantic priming and subliminal priming, subliminal perception, it works. And I think we are just getting better at it. And the more it is supported by big data, the more accurate it will be. And then, of course, there are even more direct ways into the brain, like brain-computer interfaces. And when we replicate that with sensory devices, electronic nose, and so on, we will be able to completely replicate and probably create robots. I mean, many are already being created, but many of them will be maybe almost artificial, almost intelligent as well. So just to stop here, it's better probably to discuss some of these things. Some of my conclusions are, we should not be get carried away. I think artificial intelligence is indeed an oxymoron. It is not safe, really. We have this Amara paradox too, that states that in the beginning we hype any new development, and then we overestimate the possibilities with it, and don't see maybe the dark sides of it. And in the long run, we forget about it because we hype another technology, and then we underestimate the long run impact of these technologies. And here, for example, someone made me aware of surveillance and AI. When they recognize an image as a dog, if you send them this subliminal computer image, noise, I think, or adversarial images, I hope, Serge, you can tell me more about this, then it will mislead the AI, the intelligent kind of machine, in thinking it's an ostrich. And that would, of course, have potential effects of completely undermining every surveillance system, and then also the legal system. What kind of evidence do we have if we have recordings, etc., etc., So there's a lot of danger as well involved. And here's a precedent, I think, from Christopher Columbus, where he used kind of foreknowledge of an event, a lunar eclipse, to manipulate people who were not aware of this like event happening, a lunar eclipse, to force them into doing something they would maybe otherwise not have done. So this is a clear case of manipulation in many ways to achieve something to your own kind of benefit. But of course, we can also use that maybe to achieve maybe something that is in the benefit of everyone. And this is really where we have to work. I think as lawyers, we have to see how can we make it possible for everyone to achieve the full potential of every person and all the sustainable development goals. And I think one way to do that is we have to integrate more the senses into a broader like image of the human being and how justice is going to be performed. And just to briefly like compare that also, the enormous complexity that we have already with 70 goals and so on. One of the underlying problem is that this global governance structure, the architecture that we have in place historically, is too fragmented in many ways. And I think if we use the analogy of language, of oxymora, bringing opposites together and showing that they are not mutually exclusive, that this binary thinking is maybe not the end of the story, that they can also be complementary, and that maybe there's even a kind of domino effect that once you find the right kind of balance, all of the 17 dominoes will fall and you achieved all of them together. But I think this is a long cognitive process that reminds me also of a lecture I heard once by Professor Harold Koh, who said that his father used to say that, you know, like we also need to use kind of to specialize in generalization, as I call it now, or to teach a child first about kind of specific things and then connect it to the generic term. We need both at the same time, I think. We need to specialize and generalize, but we also have to look for the complementarity between them and not stop short at contradictions. And that also refers to the senses. We cannot see them in isolation. We can study them in isolation, but we're already creating an integrated experience with the augmented or virtual reality. Even the economy is now called by some an experience economy, and the experience is based on all our senses. And even these 5 are not basically all of them. So we have many senses that I think we call it the 6th sense in a way, an unknown or not yet discovered senses. We also have to search for more like a better understanding in this context. For example, what about the sense of time? Do we have that? Everybody has it in a way, but where's the sense organ? And so on and so forth. There's a lot to be discovered. And for the law as well, there's interesting literature dealing with this question and criticizing, for example, that the law is very often too much focused on the visual sense. And this has, for example, problems, as it was found out in studies, with police lineups. Where even when they put, for example, people who were certainly not involved in any kind of crime, like they took some 5 policemen from the station and just asked them to pose, and the witnesses were asked to identify, in 30% of the cases, people just felt the pressure probably, or maybe recalled it wrongly or something, and identified someone who was certainly not involved in this criminal behavior. So we have to rethink also the whole rules of evidence, for example. So basically, there's a lot to be done, and we are living in unprecedented times with unprecedented tools for mass manipulation. And I use manipulation in a neutral way, because like I said, I manipulate myself many times too. Should I buy something? Should I not? Or should I wake up? Or should I work? So the question is only like how much of it is in control and how much of it is subliminal, and how much of it is happening in below the threshold. And I think we also have to individually uncover a lot of these things that function almost automatically in ourselves. But this is also true for the global situation, the collective situation in a society, we need to be aware of these tools, and we need to also regulate them where they pose serious threats. And then we already have a lot of these dangers, and we're aware of that, like the Google effect on memory. Like because of Google, we don't recall that much anymore. We just know where to Google it. And then we have these echo chambers in social media. The algorithms giving us constantly information that only confirms our own bias, because we like to be confirmed and not to be contested or kind of contradicted. And then for law enforcement, we already see a lot of automated one, and I think predictive one will also happen at one point. And we need to, these changes, so they are small at first, but at one point, I think they reach a tipping point where we find ourselves in a completely different setting, and where maybe a legal system as a whole is unable to create or formulate the responses that we need to these many challenges. So ultimately, I think we need to very much a debate like UNESCO's document is extremely important, a global debate, because we cannot do it alone. Nobody can. It's interconnected in many ways, and also the fate on this planet, like the Sustainable Development Goals show, is all interconnected. So we need to work on creating a trustworthy and ethical AI. We have to maintain human control over these things. That's why I think artificial intelligence is in a way the wrong term. It should be kind of assisted intelligence or assisting human intelligence. And also in particular, we need to rethink certain fundamental rights, like the right to freedom of thought in a new context where we have technologies where it might be possible to read the mind. We have to maintain the global interoperability of all these systems, and also think about how we define harms, because I think physical and psychological harm is too narrow. We need to think of collective harms, like when panic ensues from social media, from fake news or something. We need to understand maybe what the damage can be, not only for one, but for everyone. And then we need, most of all, and that's the big challenge, and that interests me the most also, how do we ensure coherence in policy making, in lawmaking, so that we can actually achieve all the goals at once. But I would not be too pessimistic, because Wittgenstein, my fellow countryman, has said once, what is thinkable is possible too. And we can see that one element of this time, these interesting times, is that, to use another oxymoron, science fiction has also proven to become true in many instances. So we can also predict the future and make it happen. And lawyers have a tool. By regulating, you may be also able to make happen what you predict for the future. So I stop here. I hope I didn't exceed the time too much. Thank you very much, and I would be glad to have some questions or critical feedback. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rostam, for these fascinating topics about subliminal AI systems. So it's very, very interesting. So at the beginning, when you start to talk about AI and that artificial intelligence is in fact an oxymoron, I remember that in fact this term was invented in 1956 by AI pioneers like McCarthy and other US researchers, and I think it was during a workshop in Dartmouth, and they regret after that these terms, because they choose this term, that it was very controversial even among the people who are researchers of AI. And I remember that in the 80s that some people don't want to use anymore these terms, because it was during the one of the AI winter, so when AI was less trendy, so people they don't want to talk anymore about AI. So it's very interesting, because at the same time there were other words other terms for like cybernetics, for example, and they prefer to use artificial intelligence at the end. So it's interesting to remember that. Yeah. So if you have any questions, please raise your hand. Yeah, we have time to have a few questions.
There is one in the chat box.
Yeah, Petra, you want to say something? Hi, Petra.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Rostam. I was a bit late in coming, but I was just interested in, how the link with SDGs, right, and the delivery of SDGs, and the fact that we have inherited in the UN very segmented or sectoral structures, and so with the need for global interoperability and let's say more cross-sensory perspectives to be able to progress the SDGs, could you then say that the way that the UN is currently structured actually prevents or hampers the delivery of the SDGs? Thanks.
Yeah, excellent. No, this is exactly actually where my interest came from, because my PhD 20 years ago dealt with the question of culture and trade, which was considered also for 2,000 years to be irreconcilable. Even the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade had this exception for cinema, for example, because cinema is considered something artistic, cultural, but not commercial. What a mistake if you look at it today. And then the Frankfurt School at the time in the 1930s therefore called it an oxymoron. The culture industry is an oxymoron, right? And based on that, I actually developed, and then I realized that there was a historical accident in 1947, which saw the International Trade Organization fall out of the UN family. It was planned to be a specialized agency under the Charter, Article 57, and it failed because the US refused to ratify it at the time. And they only took one chapter out, which became the GATT, and was then left outside the UN family. And the WTO today, still in 1995, declared we are outside, we are sui generis organization. And I think this is, of course, it's almost like you rip the heart out of a body, because trade connects everything, and trade is the transportation is the lifeline of a global system, and like it is of a body. So you're absolutely right that I think our past perception, but it's not only the UN. I've worked in a small government of Austria myself, and we have small ministries, and after every election we have a problem. How do we, what do we connect to what? Is it technology and agriculture, or technology and science, or science and schooling? So that's why I looked at the senses and language, because I think we have to look for the cognitive reasons before we find the cause in our cognition, the way we are educated, for example. We will always replicate the same thing. And it doesn't matter whether we do it globally or locally, because even, as I said, a small government, even a community probably has, well, we separate trade from this and from that, and then we very often fail to create synergy effects. But this is where Oxymora precisely provide a very useful example, like the culture industry. I still remember that I talked to a manager of an American film studio, who said like, oh, this cultural protectionism, exception culturelle or something is bad. But after a while, Spain had such a law, and then they thought we made more money with it, because you can still sell Spanish movies and American movies and make twice the amount. So as I said, we have proof that opposite terms are not only in a kind of relationship of mutual exclusivity, they're also in a very strong kind of relation of complementarity, enriching each other. And that is what we need to start training also our children, I think, because it's not always when you're the winner, you don't have to have a loser. You can be all winners, and a win-win situation is something that I think we have to look at and look for. But thank you, that's very good. Yeah. And just last point, there was in 2006 the Kofi Annan, he had the delivering as one, I think, was this initiative to reform precisely, which also reflects probably a change in the perception that we cannot just deliver without coordination. So yes, yeah, thank you.
And maybe just to add to the question of Petra, is that we have the tendency in UN to work in silos. So we are working on different SDGs. We are not connecting the dots most of the time. So I think it's very important to have maybe a more holistic view of the problem. So because there are for sure interlinks and linkages between climate change, digital technologies, poverty, etc. So it's clearly lots of links. So we have to provide a more holistic view of the SDGs, and this is most of the time not done, yeah, by the current UN agencies. Yeah. Any more questions in the room? Don't be shy to ask questions if you have questions. I think we have one more in the chat. No? Okay. More questions? Mamelo, Arm.
Okay.
Pretty.
Well, yeah, let me come in here. Thanks, Rostam, very much for that. Very interesting, and I think actually raises a lot more questions in my head. And yeah, so connecting a bit this idea of the freedom of thought and freedom from, let's say, what we see regularly now, influence campaigns and disinformation and all these kind of things, right? So there's that part of it. But from a regulation point of view, where do you draw the line? I mean, what do we consider as positive and correct influence? Particularly, you hinted at this earlier. I mean, there's a lot of work, for example, that looks at nudging, how it can be used positively to influence positive behavior towards the SDGs, for example, all right, or towards healthy eating or towards certain behaviors. But at the same time, of course, we know that it can be used very negatively. And of course, I feel like the question is how free are we in the first place? How much of free thought do we have in the first place? And I'm actually reminded by books like How to Influence People and Win Friends. I mean, these are all techniques about maybe the 80% of body language of communication, which is body language, which maybe people are not aware of. Maybe it's subliminal.
Yeah.
But if you have to regulate that, where do you draw the lines? I mean, how do you guys, from a legal regulation perspective, how do you approach this problem?
Yeah, that goes to the heart of the legal world in a way, and the problems that law has, in a sense that we are trained as lawyers very much in this kind of either or thinking. You're either guilty or you're innocent, but you're not guilty and innocent at the same time. And so here we have also these limitations of a purely binary logic. And what I try to do is to educate the students with combining both either or and both and thinking. And there are plenty of examples like O.J. Simpson, right? He was guilty in one trial and innocent in the other. And I mean, so we have plenty of examples in reality where contradictions coexist very peacefully. And in fact, we're all made from contradictions in many ways. And we need to have a debate about it. And I think a lot of these phenomena cannot be regulated at the moment in particular, and should also not be regulated. But precisely fake news is such an example, because here's another problem, and that is my current focus, the time element, right? Something may be false at first and turn out to be true. And that can also be done via manipulation. For example, a self-fulfilling prophecy is such a kind of, I can say this bottle will drop any moment, and I can make it happen or not happen. And then if you have the influence and the power to influence outcomes, it is both potentially false or true, right? And over time, who can be the judge of that, right? So in this respect, I think what we have seen, I've done a study on Macau's for the Congress of the Academy of Comparative Law on fake news, for example. And I think in Macau, there is no specific law on fake news, but there are some articles for specific situations, like a heightened state of emergency, like we had it with natural disasters, like the civil protection law, or with the infectious diseases, the pandemic, and so on. I think in these cases, it is possible to maybe, like mitigate the content, or maybe even like, say, better not spread rumors when you're not sure about it. But a general like law on fake news is impossible, because
Right.
in fact, when we think about political satire, jokes, I mean, there are so many things where it is very, very difficult to judge clearly whether it is right or wrong. And more has to be done, and law cannot do it alone anyways. I think more has to be done with awareness raising, education, and a debate, and the understanding that we are all in the same boat. And I think if we manage to achieve that, then probably most of these cases will hopefully no longer emerge as a conflict, as a problem, but merely we might even like laugh about it together as a joke, right? And not see it as a kind of serious problem anymore. But it's a long way, and the kind of the sophistication of some of these technologies is just yeah, quite scary, I find, what I've read in research for my book. But you know better probably how far it is that these algorithms can already penetrate our thoughts and alter our behavior. But it is impressive. Yeah.
Oh, thanks, Rostam.
Thank you.
Hi, Rostam.
Hello. Nice to see you too. Thank you for your, like, as I said in the beginning, the inspiration to the book, and many more like works that I'm doing. They're all a direct outcome of our interesting conversations and the need to do interdisciplinary discourse, for sure.
I have good news to share with you. So the paper-based book that we ordered just arrived today.
Oh yeah, you know that you have the book.
I have received a copy.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's great. I haven't seen it yet, so my publisher hasn't sent it to me.
So you can borrow it.
I come over here later. Thank you.
Yeah.
I hope it's of interest. Yeah.
Do we have more questions in the room? No more questions? Yeah. Maybe I have, oh, Min, you have a question, yeah. Please, Min. Go ahead.
Thank you, Professor.
Hi, Min.
Hi, Dr. Serge, and hi, everyone. Thank you, Professor, for your sharing. I feel it's very interesting. And being honest, I don't have questions, but I want to share my personal feeling and well, like my observation with you, and perhaps it's really in line with your study result and sharing today. Before that, I attended the World Artificial Intelligence Conference, which was organized in Shanghai. And I think this is a conference which is very global, and lots of like advisors and AI technical experts, and also like companies and representatives, even from civil societies, they attended. So I find a very interesting phenomenon. The conference was consisted of many series of activities, but only one session was about AI governance. So, and I attended the AI governance forum, and I asked one of the researchers a question. So all of you, for me, I think it seems that every attendee during the conference, they reach a consensus or a common idea, which is the using or AI application is the future trend, and no one is doubting that. So I asked the question to the researcher, and you do the research about AI, but you never question AI, do you? Don't you? And the researcher said, yeah. So I'm just thinking about your sharing today, and you mentioned that lots of things that people we don't have actually that we don't realize, or lots of things are still unaware. So I'm thinking that maybe as a researcher or like the people, and it has a very big or large space for us to, to increase the awareness about the negative impact and the positive impact of the technology. And you also mentioned that the technology is neutral. So yeah, that it is, but it also I mean, in a context where the development of technology is still in a context of social environment. So yeah, that I feel that you are sharing is very enlightening, and we cannot just view the technology as a very independent issue, which should be relied or based in the social environment. Just for sharing my personal experience with you.
No, thank you very much indeed. I think as part of this process, we need to also convince, for example, the business community that maybe, like I said, my past experience was about the debate about culture and trade, where the business community felt like this is a threat, you know, like to promote cultural diversity is a threat to our business, right? Whereas interestingly, economists had actually said, well, because of the diversity of the world, we are doing trade in the first place, because if you have the same product everywhere, what's the point of trading it, right? So also in cognitive terms, I mean, a cultural creativity from different places is an enrichment, especially to the economy and to even the sustainability of decision making, as we know. Like, and therefore, if we can, I think, discuss it together and find the mutually like complementary aspects to that and convince everyone that we are all better off with that, then there is hope that we will avoid mistakes that we made in the past, where we maybe looked only for a quick profit making and then paid a much higher price. Also companies like may go bankrupt over a mistake they make, and nobody wants that either, probably. So if we can include everyone and all the kind of stakeholders, then I think we have a chance to really achieve, and that's the point, to come together. We have already, this is the Anthropocene, no? We say we are in a dominant factor, but the problem is someone else said there's actually another paradox. It was a book written in the 50s about the nature of prejudice. He said, paradoxically, we have made such great progress in terms of technology, but very little in understanding the social relations of human beings. So the social sciences, in a way, are lagging behind here. And then all the surplus we have created in terms of, he says that sadly, turns out to be blown up in wars and conflicts. So the wealth that we create from these machines is not used for the future, for the planet, for future generations. We blow it up in arms and weapons, which might benefit a few, but definitely not the world. And that is, so thank you very much. Yeah, I think I share your observation completely. But we need to find ways to enhance the communication here.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you, Min, for your questions. So if we don't have any more questions, maybe we can close the session today, the seminar today. So thank you, everyone, for joining this seminar. So thank you, Professor Rostam, for sharing your thoughts on this very interesting and amazing topic. We'll organize more webinars in the future on the same topic. So please have a look to our website, macao.edu.unu.edu or Twitter handle UNU@Macao for future announcements. So thank you again. I will stop now the recording